difficulty of motivating students to read books. And I've actually created a lesson in which I plan to tackle this. So I've created a lesson, and its sole objective is to transfer the purpose of literature to my students. And these can be any level. I think the lesson which I've created can be adapted to different levels. So this is what I would like to talk to you about today. So it's, the title is also, but how should we introduce literature to our pupils? So I've thought of, the first way, I thought of two ways of approaching this. The first approach is a behavioristic approach. And this is that I could talk about the purpose of literature and then show the students by looking at a literature text how they can learn something about the context, how they can learn something about the social construct, and how they can learn something about the text. So this behavioristic approach, as you can see in the picture, if this is me as a teacher, which I hope I don't look like now, maybe I have another 10 years to go. What happens in this kind of setting is that I do the talking and the students are supposed to soak up the knowledge. So I can give them a text, explain to them, look, you can learn about this and this society, it's in the text, you can distill it from the text. I can show them how a person acts in a certain circumstance which is quite extreme, for example, and I can show them that there is a certain style of writing that is interesting. But personally, I don't think this is a very good approach to take to transfer the purpose of literature, and the reason why is that learning takes place only from the teacher's perspective. If I'm going to tell the students that literature is purposeful, they're going to have to take my word for it, and I think that is difficult because it's an abstract concept, and it's also, students have negative stereotyped ideas about literature, and as a teacher I also realize that I'm going against the trend, because in the last, I would say, 20 years, people have started to read less and less books. So I think to transfer the purpose of literature, I have to do more as a teacher. So I thought of approaching this in a different way, which is what I will show you now. I've thought of approaching this from a communicative, task-based approach, which, unlike behaviorism, follows social constructivism. And so what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to select authentic learning materials in a real-life communicative setting, and within this setting I'm going to have students perform tasks. And then finally I'm going to let students themselves draw conclusions about the purpose of literature. So this is a difficult thing to do, but I've thought about it and I've selected a real-life communicative setting and a literature text, and I will show you this on the next page. The setting which I've chosen is the film King's Speech in 1963, and the literature text is the lyrics of I Have a Dream. So I'll have students performing several activities, 3 activities, one which relates to each purpose of literature, and then I'll let students decide whether they think literature is purposeful. So on the next slides I will show you which activities, engaging activities, I will have the students perform. So the first activity, and I will show you this, this is the approaching literature as a context. I'm going to show the students a film which is called The Assassination of Martin Luther King. It takes 7 minutes, and I'll show you the first 3 minutes of this film. And in this film you should be able to find out the first 2 points which actually are part of the context which I want students to reconstruct. So I'll have them complete an assignment, a visual listening assignment, and they will actually, by doing this assignment, uncover the following details. They will find out that Martin Luther King was a preacher who became a civil rights activist. They will find out that he wanted to create equal rights for the people of his community, and they will find out that this was necessary as the 1960s society was a racist society, and so on. So why don't you watch the first 4 minutes of the film. You can see whether you can uncover these details.
was rushed to hospital after being shot. He's badly wounded. At the time, King is a towering figure, known throughout the world for his inspired direction of the US civil rights movement. But in his high-profile fight to win more rights for America's black community, especially in the Deep South, King has also earned the undying hatred of a cabal of violent white extremists who despise him and all he stands for. They see him as a threat to their way of life. They want him out of the way. But would they go so far as trying to get him killed? April 3rd, 1968, Atlanta, mid-morning. King flies to Memphis and checks into the Lorraine Motel. He's come to lend his support to a group of black city sanitation workers. He's been behind them since February, when they went on strike demanding better pay and conditions. Now King is determined to get them a good deal. That evening, King heads for the Mason Temple, where he gives a typically powerful, yet strangely prophetic address.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
It will become one of King's most famous speeches, but it sounds almost as if he'd received a death threat. The son of a preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on January the 15th.
So I'll stop the film now. So then, after students have completed this exercise, do you think that you'll be able to uncover some of the points from the first three minutes of the film which you have seen? You can see how it works. So after the assignment has been completed, I'll ask students to answer this question. And why will I do this? This is because I want them to later on reflect whether they have been able to uncover some elements of the 1960s society. So then, after I've activated students' relevant background knowledge about Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, I will move on to the second exercise. And the second exercise is a visual reading, listening activity in which I want to get students to discover the artistic qualities of writing. So how am I going to do this? I've got an assignment to show you how this assignment works. I have created an exercise which we can now all complete in class. So what am I going to do? Students will be watching King actually delivering his speech. And during his speech, maybe you should read it actually. Read the first 10 to 15 lines of the page. So, have you finish reading about what we're going to do. So I'm going to let students discover what how several speech writing techniques have been incorporated into his speech by the writers of the speech. So there are two questions which I'd like you to answer. One is while you're watching the film, which I will show you now, which is part of King's speech. One is to see if you can see which speech writing techniques have been used. And the other is to find out if you can see how King works the audience while he's actually speaking to the crowd by using his voice. How does he use his voice to work the audience? And I'll start the film at 9 minutes. So the speech will already have started.
We cannot be satisfied with the plans that we shall always march ahead.
Yeah. It starts at 9 minutes and 2 seconds. The transcript which I've
They
written
have
down.
come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees for civil rights. When will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution, staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I think
Okay, so you have seen the King delivering part of the speech I Have a Dream. Does anybody know what technique has been used in the bolded part of the text? Here it is the red part of the text. Were you able to find that out?
He unites the audience with a cause
Yes, and how did you do that?
by using we, so the audience identifies with the
Yeah.
speech.
It's called the we're all in the same boat technique. And by using words like we and our and us, the orator tries to create the impression that he realizes what the pain points of the audience are, because he also has suffered himself. Yeah. And the underlined words, did anybody have an idea?
Repeating the message.
Hmm?
Repeating the message.
Yes, by repeating, it's called like, by repeating a phrase at the beginning of each sentence, you emphasize the point that you're trying to make. Yeah. And the last, which is it is here the green part.
It's about referring to the background of the people. Where are they from? And it,
Also sending them out on a mission. Go back, now you've heard what you can feel, now just go back to your own
spread the word.
villages.
That could also be like something that he tried to do, but did you also remember that he said this very quickly? He said it like, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of the northern cities. He said it like that, didn't he? We could play it again. And it's actually called the machine gunning technique.
Okay.
And it's actually by bombarding the audience with a lot of information, you try to impress the audience with the knowledge that you have. It's also a technique which he has used to create, to make an impression on the audience.
So it's more the way he uses his voice than the message he
A
uses.
combination of the two, because I mean, it doesn't really matter all these places, you know. He's just summed up 10 places.
Mhm.
He wants to
Right.
bombard them with information, but I agree with you, it's also how he uses his voice, because he also controls the speed, and this brings us to the second point. It's like, how does he use his voice to control the audience? Like you said, he controls the speed of his voice to do this, to create a dramatic effect. And also,
monotone.
hmm?
It's very monotone in his
Yes.
speech.
And
and
also
yeah.
very crescendo.
Yes.
Yeah, he uses the intonation of his
Yeah.
voice to create a dramatic effect.
And pauses.
Yes, that's also, these are the 3 points which I had mentioned: intonation, speed, and pauses. He gives.
He speaks like a preacher.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
speaks exactly. That's why he has learned how to become a great orator, because he used to be a preacher, so he knows how to control and work an audience. He's basically been doing it all his life
Yes.
before he became a civil rights activist. So he leaves also pauses to give the audience a chance to applaud.
And it is more of a preach than a
Yeah.
Exactly.
than a speech.
Exactly, and that's why he would also be a natural person to become a civil rights activist, because he knows how to work an audience. Yeah. So by doing this exercise, at the end, turn back to my presentation. So after students have completed this exercise, in fact, I might also show them more of the speech, because I can also use this speech to relate like the origins of the United States to the students. You know, they can learn about how the United States came into existence, because that's actually discussed at the beginning of the speech. But by showing them this speech, silly. By showing them this speech, you can probably understand that. What I think is that most students will have the feeling that they can see that writing has an artistic quality after they have done this exercise. And then to relate now to I've also created a task which relates to the last purpose of literature. That's this activity. And this is a group activity, and this was the most difficult activity for me to create, because how am I going to get students to relate to the social construct of literature? But I thought about this, and I created group assignments. I'm going to hand out these photos to the students. Now these photos have something in common which makes me think that they will work. What do they have in common? They have in common that they deal with a hypothetical moral dilemma. For example, in the first picture, imagine that your mother has been, imagine that a very close relative of yours has been killed. And imagine that this has been done in a place where the death penalty still exists. Then you are faced with a moral dilemma. On the one hand, do you want the death penalty to be carried out so that you receive the ultimate compensation for the loss which you have suffered? Or on the other hand, do you acknowledge the right for every person to have the right to live? So, in this case, on the back of the picture it says, what would you say if you were Martin Luther King's sister and the judge asked you, is it the family's wish that Mr. James Allray is to be sentenced to death? Now, Mr. James Allray is the person who was found out to be the murderer of Martin Luther King. Imagine if you were asked that. For some people, I think they would really want the death penalty to feel better about it. But other people, they would acknowledge that the right for any person to live is greater no matter what has been happened, no matter what has been, what misjustice has been carried out against you. So I think that each of these pictures deals with a moral dilemma. And therefore, I think that students will be able to talk about these photos well, because there will be some disagreement about how they would act in these extreme circumstances. So here, for example, some students might actually decide to try and convince their father not to kill Dr. Martin Luther King, and others, they would maybe not do anything. And here some people would betray their classmates, and for others loyalty would stop them from doing so. So in each case, I think students will act differently. And I've tried to make sure that all of these situations relate to the context of Martin Luther King. And then just to sum up how I would end the lesson, because this can all be done, I think, in one lesson, 1.5 lessons. How are we going to draw conclusions about literature at the end of the lesson? Well, I'm going to inform students that King's speech is actually very famous. In fact, most people consider it to be the most famous speech that has ever been held. And it is famous because it has a unique quality. I found the answer to this on the internet, what its unique quality is, but I could sense it. Maybe someone here knows. What is? Does anybody have an idea of what most people consider a unique quality of King's speech? It unifies people. So it brings people together, people of different races, different backgrounds. And so I'll ask you, can you guess its unique quality? So it definitely has a unique quality. Then I'm going to write down the definition of literature, and this also comes from the Culture 1 portfolio. So a lot of people might think that King's speech is not literature, but it is. You know, it's a very important part of our world heritage, I feel. It unifies everyone in the world. So I think that most students agree with me that it is literature. And then I come to point 6. I'm going to ask students to reflect on what they have learned from assignments 1, 2, and 3. And as you saw before, here I asked them to answer the true-false questions. So I think that most of them agree that because they have learned about Martin Luther King's speech, they have been able to learn more about the 1960s, they have been able to learn about the artistic qualities of writing. And if Martin Luther King had never written down his speech, this would have no meaning for them. So it has provided students with the opportunity to learn something, and this is really the purpose of literature. So I think that in the end, I will be able to draw the following conclusions with my students at the end of the lesson. The speech I have agreed has enabled us to learn about the 1960s, and I can generalize that finding. It has enabled us to learn about the artistic qualities of writing, so we've been able to uncover several speech writing techniques which were incorporated in the text. And it has enabled us to learn that people behave different in extreme circumstances. So these are the 3 purposes of literature that now uncovered at the end of the lesson, rather than the behavioristic approach. So then this is the final slide. The conclusion of this presentation is that I tried to contrast both learning approaches to see what would be best for me, what would be the best way for me to introduce literature to my students. And the behavioristic approach, the main difference is, in the behavioristic approach, I decide. And I transmit the importance of literature at the beginning of the lesson. And in the communicative approach, the collaborative learning environment decides. I mean, some students could, for example, say that they think Martin Luther King's speech does not have a unique quality. So in this case, they don't have to think it's literature. No, it's up to them. And the second is that the importance is discovered at the end of the lesson. And this is an important difference. So I decided to transmit the purpose of literature to my students. I decided to use the communicative approach. And why? because I believe it stimulates effective learning. And how does this work? Well, you can read for yourself how this works, but in the end I think it helps students to have their literature radar on when they actually do start reading books, because they will know what to look for, because they've discovered this themselves, the 3 concepts of literature. And this will ultimately help them to really read more effectively and to find the pieces of information that are important and relevant. And lastly, the communicative method, I think, stimulates motivation. And why? Because, as you have seen, there are many visual elements in a communicative setting, and this means that I think that a lot of students who learn differently will actually be able to relate to the learning which takes place and the learning objective which I've set, which is to transfer the purpose of literature. So this is a motivated student.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to give him feedback on the presentation?
I like that you used something else than a book, because you are introducing it. But I would like to know a little bit more about your target group.
And the target group, basically, I'm not testing any learning objective. I'm not grading anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to create motivation for reading, and I want them to discover the purpose of literature.
Okay, and on what level?
I think you could even do this at MAP, this is a VMBO level, but maybe you would have to redesign the discovery of the artistic qualities of writing a bit. But you can really get attention for reading, and you don't need a lot of text to do this by using the speech. You know, and it really brings the speech alive by using the authentic, real-life communicative setting, I think.
Yeah, I think
You know, and also students will learn a lot about the 1960s. I mean, a lot of these things are still relevant today, I believe. You know, I still think that.
But then the message is of the literature you chose, not in the speech. The message of the speech itself is therefore awesome.
To me, yeah. I mean, I've also thought about when I teach this lesson, I will also discuss the theme of the speech. You know, and does anybody have an idea of the theme of the speech? I mean, there are several kind of opinions which people have, but I mean, there is really consensus about what the theme is. The theme of the speech.
I think that it is possible to be on the same level.
Yes, yeah. Basically, the theme of the speech is that in a world created by God, I mean, this relates to the background of Martin Luther King, discrimination is unacceptable. And especially because discrimination still takes place in the world. We can see it all over the place, really. That speech is still relevant today. You know, and this is also another, for LWT3, I also have different objectives which I want to reach, which is also why I've chosen the speech. So, one thing that I want to accomplish is to show students the purpose of literature.